Why hello there my lovely nerds, and welcome back. It's our second video delving into the science of setting, and this time we're exploring the science and technology of nautical fantasies, with a particular focus on my favourite subgenre of the high seas. Can you guess? Obviously piratical fantasies. It's going to be a long one, so without further ado, were I to pull up examples of piratical fantasies, then you could be forgiven for thinking that piracy only took place in the 17th and 18th century. But much like nautical fantasies at large, piratical fantasies can stretch through the ages. Broadly defined as any fantasy tale involving characters who engage or have engaged in the taking of one vessel by another, piratical fantasies can have forms that don't involve ships, such as the piracy of planes. But, like me, this video needs some solid boundaries, or who knows where we'll end up. So we'll be sticking to piracy at sea. Unlike many of the other subgenres we'll get into in this playlist, piratical fantasies have a very long time frame. Piracy has been reported since the 14th century BC, when a group of ocean raiders known as the Sea Peoples attacked ships in the Aegean and Mediterranean civilizations. But that's just the first recorded incidents, so it's likely not a very accurate start date, since boats and ships have been around for a lot longer. The first record of boats being built were in the 4th millennium BC in ancient Egypt, and you have to assume that piracy happened during those times too, because, well, humans, eh? Which means we've got a lot of ground to cover, especially since sea piracy is still going on to the present day. So that's our time frame. To not get too lost though, we're going to focus on the advances of three main areas through the years and how use of them affects the story. One quick side note before we start. You might also want to consider attitudes towards privateering in your world. Privateering is similar to piracy, but the captain acts under the orders of the state, so when they capture a merchant ship, it becomes the property of a country. Privateering started in the 13th century, but the word privateer didn't come about until the 17th century. The emergence of the modern centralised military control caused a decline of privateering, so it was gone by the end of the 19th century. Therefore, the window is much shorter than for piracy, which is a shame, because I'm hoping to see at least one Egyptian piratical fantasy hit the market after this video drops. Not to say that the Egyptians are the only underrepresented subgenre of piratical fantasy. No indeed. With Greek sailors exploring India and England, along with Arabian and Chinese sailors also hitting the waves to map the continents, there is a lot of unexplored territory here. One particularly interesting consideration you'll want to take into account when researching your stories is what the attitudes towards piracy were at the time. Don't make the mistake of thinking that pirates were always ostracised. During early ancient Greek times, piracy was actually an accepted source of income. But this changed by the end of the Roman era, as exemplified by Julius Caesar enacting a very painful revenge on his own piratical abductors. So don't make any assumptions, and let's get on with the evolution of the ship. Now this will obviously be a brief overview. This portion of the video alone has been the subject of many textbooks, so the same disclaimer applies here as it does to all of these videos. Think of it as more of a guideline to help future research that you'll need to do on your chosen setting. The design of boats and ships has obviously advanced a long way over the years. The first boats used oars, not sails. They range size-wise, but there are depictions of them being 300 feet long, and they were used for carrying obelisks down the Nile. Sails were used for later vessel design, often in the same vessel as those with the oars, and they were often steered with a pair of stern-mounted oars. Boats of various sizes would crisscross the Nile and the canals and the seas to other parts of Africa and the Mediterranean. The oldest crafts were built from papyrus, but wood became the norm later on. In later Roman times, you had 2 to 3 levels of oarsmen. Up to a dozen banks were known to propel the largest boats, but this led to complications, such as the long oars losing much of their force of their sweep. Eventually, it reached a point where it was recognised that the design of the warships and the cargo ships needed to diverge. At this point, ship design became a very important undertaking. Fighting ships required speed, weaponry, and adequate space for fighters. Plus, they needed the ability to maneuver in any direction at any time. Long, narrow rowed ships became the standard for naval warfare. Trading ships, meanwhile, needed to carry lots of goods with as small a crew as was practicable, so they became as round as they could while still being navigable. When creating your secondary world, understanding the geopolitics of the time and in the years prior will be essential for understanding the evolutionary pressures on the boats and the ships used by that culture. We see this same pressure on ship evolution later on, when English and Spanish vessels started competing for naval dominance through the discovery of other worlds. As more countries took to the high seas, international competition drove the need to advance shipbuilding, mainly because there was a lot of money to be made from trading with or pillaging from other countries. Any small edge during a very long voyage could be a huge advantage. Another key factor you'll need to consider is the effect of your location. Mediterranean and northern boats were commonly rowed, but the cyclonic storms found year-round in the Baltics and the North Sea encouraged the use of sails. Why? Because in the north, the wind frequently shifts direction, so delays from the sails not catching the wind are short-lasting, while in the Mediterranean, you could be waiting for a very long time for the wind to change in a more favourable direction, meaning that oars were far more reliable. Weather, eh? A world builder's best friend. Who would have thought it? But what about pirate ships specifically? Well, in the early days, pirate ships didn't diverge much from the regular vessels, but as time went by, pirate galleys became smaller, more nimbler, more lightly armed. Often they were crewed in large numbers, so they could overwhelm the often minimal crews of a merchant ship. This design made them harder to catch and better at hunting other vessels. But you will need to also think about how the weather affects your pirates too. In some regions, the weather dictated when piracy could occur. Often it would ebb and flow with the trade and monsoons. Pirate seasons in some regions were at particular times of year and were even known to be brought by the pirate wind. You'll also need to consider how big a problem piracy is in your world, and therefore how much effort has been put into trying to combat the problem. Using oared vessels to combat pirates was common, since they could try to outrow them, and purpose-built galleys were made for this in the 16th century, but they weren't built in sufficient numbers to check piracy until the 18th century. So vessel design is a key factor. It links to limitations of the weather and limitations of the laws of physics, which is very interesting for us as fantasy authors because limitations like the availability of weather to power sails or the maximum carrying capacity of a vessel can all be broken by magic. Do you have mages able to produce wind where there was none before? Then what effect does this have on the trade routes? Or what about the weight that the vessels can carry and the consequences that will have on the design of the ships? These videos are all about giving you rules for the time. It's up to you to break them. Next up, let's talk about the navigation abilities of your pirates. In the early years, navigation was done through staying close to land and navigating by landmarks. Sailors would usually travel by day and seek harbour or calm anchorage at night. If they ventured out of sight of the land, then they could determine the latitude, the direction of north and south, by the height of the sun during the day or by the North Star at night. Some more low-key methods of navigation that you can pepper your story with are the use of species of birds, whales or other animals, such as through their behaviour and their migration habits and how that allowed people to navigate. If you want more high-tech navigation in your story, then you've got to wait until about 2000 BC. The Phoenicians had started using charts to observe the sun and the stars at this time in order to determine the direction of travel, but it was a while after that until some really significant advances happened. In the 11th century came the compass, the 15th century the astrolabe, a device that helps figure out latitude, and in the 16th century came the chip log, a crude speedometer that's knotted at regular intervals and then it's weighted to drag in the water so that when it's tossed overboard at the stern, you can count the number of knots over a set period of time and calculate the speed. In the 18th century came the chronometer, which allowed navigators to figure out longitude while at sea. Then, in the 20th century, we got a whole range of important tech, such as radar in the 1930s, long-range navigation in the 1940s, and GPS in the 1970s. So that's what actually happened. How do we as fantasy authors change this? My favourite way would be through the creation of fantasy creatures that can help with navigation. Sea monsters that migrate a certain way during a certain season every year to mate. So get thinking about some fantasy creatures that you can create for your world and how the pirates can use those creatures to help them find their plunder. Another way is to use magic in some way to mark out the trading routes at sea, or to use magic to help predict when certain winds will blow, and therefore how to most quickly get to where your pirates need to go. Just remember though, if any of these infer knowledge or advantage on one culture more than another, then you'll need to think about the bigger consequences of this change for your world. If you have only one country with access to that magic, then at the very least there is going to be some international dispute about it. Hey, there'll also be plenty more for your pirates to steal. With that, we move on to the weaponry available for your pirates on their ships. Before we dive in, bear in mind that different countries developed and stole these technologies at different times. So be sure to check the particulars for whichever civilization and time period you're planning on using in your story. If you're going for an early piratical fantasy, then you may well be limited to swords, crossbows and spear type weaponry, which will obviously have a big effect on the style of fighting your pirates will be getting up to. However, these weapons were also used a lot by the pirates even after the newer weaponry that I'm about to get into was developed. The reasoning being that pirates weren't typically wealthy, which meant that most of them had to make do with whatever weapons they could beg, borrow, or more likely steal. A simple club, pikes, axes, spears, machetes, throwing knives, the long pike, the halberd, whatever was needed to gain access to the vessel they were preying upon. The earliest significant advance to the weapons available was the grenade, the earliest record of which was in the Byzantine period in the 8th century. The technology then spread throughout the Islamic world and into the Far East, and eventually coming into widespread military use in Europe in the 16th century. Next came the cannons, which were developed in the 12th century, but were first recorded in battle in the 14th century. The matchlock pistol came about in the 16th century, with the flintlock version becoming available in the 17th century. There were some double-barrel pistols around this time, but they were expensive and rare. Oh, and pirates often tied their pistols to their belt when they fired them, so they didn't lose something so valuable during battle. There was no central armory on a pirate vessel. The rarity of a pistol and its likely ornate nature meant that the presence of one on a captain's belt helped display their success to others. Muskets came about in the 16th century. Initially they were matchlock lit, but they were replaced by flintlock in later parts of the 16th century, which was faster, but I'm sure we'll get into more detail about that when we get onto flintlock fantasies soon. The musket evolved over the years, and pirates often sawed off both the barrel and the stock ends to make it more convenient to wield in close fighting situations. Like with most of these guns, the musket, the pistol, they're single firing, so an experienced pirate has some pre-prepared charges at hand. The arquebus is another 16th century firearm that came about, a gun that has a vicious recoil, and early versions even had a hook to attach the weapon to a fixed object like a wall when firing. The blunderbuss came about in the 17th century, and it was particularly effective against enemies who outnumbered you since it just hit everything in sight. But the kick that this gun had was capable of breaking a rib if not held correctly. In the 19th century came the revolving gun, the machine gun and the automatic gun, which, because of their increased firepower, have obvious impacts on the types of battles that can take place. So what do you need to factor in if you've got magic involved with regards to your piratical weaponry? Well, the key factors are the power and the range and the ability to reload these weapons, and therefore of any magical attacks. Long-range magic in a time before muskets and cannons meant that the ships would be engaging in a much more advanced style of battle than would otherwise have happened at the time. Perhaps you have defensive magics that can prevent many of the traditional forms of attack from being effective. If so, what was developed in their stead? And then you've got to think about how this magic will have affected the design of the ships that we were discussing earlier. You make one little change and a whole butterfly of effects will unfold. Well, I hope you found this video fascinating. I certainly enjoyed researching it, So be off with your alma hearties and get on with your tales. See you next time for more science of setting. Bye, my nerds!